Good morning, afternoon, evening. I'm based in Hong Kong. It's currently afternoon here, and thanks for your attention. I know that some of us are running out of energy for webinars and online calls and all that sort of stuff, and I think it's been really testing time with many things in terms of how we figure out to communicate with folks. And I'm really pleased to be able to share some thoughts with you today. In terms of this session, I've been asked to talk a little bit about PropTech in China, business process and IoT, making PropTech relevant, and they're basically topics that are all very key to me in terms of what I do, and so yeah, happy to talk about them. People often ask what I do. My answer is pretty simple, and that is I bring process to real estate. Sounds simple, boring, but actually it means many things. I've focused on people, process, and technology in real estate for almost 40 years. Process automation has been rapidly evolving, and I think up until a few years ago, really business process automation, or BPA was the term in terms of using workflows. More recently, robotic process automation, RPA, was introduced using machine learning, and now we're seeing artificial intelligence, and all of those things layer together in terms of what I call intelligent process automation. And the real estate industry has really been a laggard, and Asia, where I'm based right now, quite a bit slower than other regions in terms of adoption of tech. But China's been a standout there in terms of doing its own thing in a different way. And for many firms in Asia, we're still working on getting them off spreadsheets, off paper-based processes, and I think the rapid advances in RPA, IPA are really going to change that quite dramatically very soon. And now I think a few things happen when an organization first steps into that process automation place and that space, and that is processes get standardized, which means things get done the same way. Data gets cleaned up, and a lot more data gets made visible or surfaced. Interesting fact is that RPA alone is forecast to remove about 140 million jobs globally by 2025, and I think that's going to be a challenge. We're already seeing a lot of it happening already. We're certainly working on some of those things. And to talk a little bit about who I work for. So Yadi started Yadi, this company, in 1984, and we've been helping real estate companies automate process ever since. Originally, the toolset was General Ledger, and that evolved into an ERP platform, and that connected businesses to each other. Sometime later, we moved into connecting businesses with customers and really B2C and vendors and investors, and further automating processes and providing ways that these parties can self-service their needs online. Most recently, we've really ventured into the IoT space in a big way and have been connecting business to property. And this has created a lot of new opportunities for us. So I'd like to touch briefly on the COVID situation, and not so much the COVID situation itself, but how we're seeing PropTech respond. And what I'm talking about is the real estate industry has had to respond to the COVID situation, and like everyone else, and PropTech has responded to what the real estate industry needs. That's a lot of stuff around health continuity, business continuity, analytics, and communication. And a little bit about each of those. I think that the transactions and project space has seen a lot of disruption. There's a lot of needs for further automating processes and bringing in tools for remote inspections, etc., and that's happening and definitely moving forward dramatically. In terms of operational issues, we've seen a lot of requirements around infection control and around social distancing enforcement and monitoring, and a lot of tools in terms of AI and in terms of robots in that space. Other areas being business continuity, and it's been interesting to see organisations that hadn't necessarily accounted for remote working as part of their business continuity plans. So a lot of stress testing of things, a lot of checking on supply chains, etc. It's really been quite a busy time. And then managing the business, and in particular, we've been helping a lot of our clients how to deal with processing or assessing, processing, and a large number of abatement requests, rent abatement requests, forecasting those, understanding the impact on financials, etc., and getting that done quickly. Also, a lot of more reliance on cloud in terms of better understanding how cloud can help with remote working and how there is a real need to absolutely get rid of paper in our business processes these days. And then finally, I think a lot more communication and reporting. So improved communication tools like the ones we're using, and a lot of additional reporting to management, to investors, to customers, vendors, staff, etc. It's been a challenging time. Now to talk about China. So for me, as a person who's been involved in China for some time, it's a unique culture and has a major, and that culture has had a major influence on real estate in China and how real estate is designed, built, used. That culture comes from the sense of family and very much expressed in things like the hutongs, that are the courtyard houses that you see in traditional environments in China. And that's really shaped a lot of what we see today. But perversely, the modern culture of an entrepreneurial nation that is super competitive is really what's shaping the habits and trends and innovations that we see. And that's something a lot of folk in the West don't really understand. China is home to some of the world's largest tech unicorns and also a host of smaller companies that are all producing technology that have an impact on real estate through e-commerce, smart cities, building technology, artificial intelligence, CCTV. Lots of things are going on very, very quickly, and in a market that's heavily supported by the government and by education. We're all working together with industry to deliver better outcomes, and with an additional incentive of things like Belt and Road and other initiatives that together are creating a platform where Chinese businesses can see their way to move their technology solutions overseas. Looking ahead, I think there'll be rapid rates of urbanization and gentrification in China continuing, and similarly a strong demand for better lifestyle. And what you're seeing with organizations like Alibaba, etc., setting up smart cities, they're really building models that are replicable, and I think we'll see a lot more of them. In terms of those cities, it's really about not just how smart they are, but the buildings and the cities need to be connected to smart processes. So what I'm really keen to see is a lot better handoff when it comes to working with different solutions. So I wouldn't necessarily call it integration when it comes to apps, but definitely handoff between apps. That's really where the space is right now. If you look at folks particularly in China, most of the folks around their early 20s don't actually own a laptop. They do everything on a phone, and that's the way they work. And they see it differently. And similarly, in terms of use of apps, in terms of giving up privacy, it's a very different world where there's an acceptance of that and an acceptance of it for greater good. And that's really seeing a lot more things happen in China than that perhaps would not happen elsewhere in the world in terms of development of tools and adoption of those tools and getting benefits from those tools. Not necessarily saying I agree with all of that, just saying that's really what's going on. And the other thing I'd say is it's really about an evolution rather than a revolution. And that's really about the fact that smart cities aren't something that happen overnight. They evolve. And to me, the ultimate test of when a city is smart is when you see local traffic engineers routinely specifying internet connectivity for traffic signals, fire hydrants, and such, ubiquitous and humble devices. That demand for better living is really caught up with wider concerns about sustainability. So you're also seeing real estate organizations in China, as well as the government, trying to do as much as they can, not only to clean up the air, but to make sure that air inside buildings is clean. So the variety, the scope, and the support for, I guess, PropTech and initiatives in China is significant. In addition to that, you're seeing the unicorns I mentioned before, the really large players who have ventured heavily into the retail space in terms of providing tools that better enable process and the customer experience in retail. That flows through to logistics, where in particular, even with the most recent situation, China's supply chains have really experimented with different ways of managing the spread of infection using compartmentalized logistics models, which has shown a different way of doing things that potentially is more efficient and changing the last mile, the last kilometre, the last 10 metres, etc. And that's combined with the fact that as affluence grows in the country, you're seeing a dramatic increase in the levels of traffic and congestion. So that, along with that desire for better product and more high-end products. So you're seeing really quite a lot of demand for improved logistics, delivery same day, and more demanding expectations around it. And at the same time, we're seeing how all of this works together, where you have organizations that have huge data pools. So the likes of Tencent and Alibaba have massive data pools, the likes of which we've not seen anywhere else in the world, not only because of the number of users, but also because of the scope of things of the activities users undertake within those data pools to generate that data. It's really quite amazing to see the volume of data and its scope. So before I get too far into IoT, and really part of my theme here is connecting the building and the business. And from that perspective, I want to talk about process very briefly and make sure that people understand really what good process is about. And for me, the core of good process is really about organizations taking a step back and not looking at process from their own perspective, but looking at it from their customer's perspective. And that to me is the key value, is that if you truly understand what your customers expect, and if you design your processes around what your customers expect, you'll, at the end of the day, process, it's not really what I'm focused on in terms of lead to least, but it's really about saying it's about the customer, and let's not forget that, and let's put the customer at the center of process. Now, if you go to the next step and say, okay, we're going to connect buildings to process, then I like to use the term of looking at buildings as devices. And if you think about buildings as devices and understand them from that perspective and think about the design of them from that perspective, then there's things that you need to do differently. And if you think about the fact that with 5G today, particularly in China, there's already 300 million people on 5G, enjoying 5G in China in about 40 cities. So, you know, a building backbone that supports the data rates and the abilities of a 5G network is basically essential. In addition, buildings need to be built around the ability to gather and produce their own data, and then the ability to locally compute and provide response times that are sensible, but at the same time draw on wider tools in terms of AI. And then at the end of the day, I think one of the questions that folk need to think about is what is the user experience, and how does the user experience come together? If I take that to the next step, one of the main areas of focus for PropTech and for Yadi is connecting the business to the property, or B2P. We do this via the ERP and IoT. A key aspect to understanding the connection between the business to the property is the complexity curve and how that correlates to the value curve. And China has advanced well up the curve and has many applications where IoT devices are directly exposed to, I guess, exposing business process to users. It's allowed the real estate industry in China to better adapt how buildings respond to change and requirements, particularly in situations like COVID. One of the things I'd say, if you think about this diagram and digest it a little, is that level of complexity can be really tricky. And again, I'd say, in my opinion, it's an evolution, not a revolution. because when it comes to buildings, you can't really control how sophisticated your users are, and therefore you need to be able to cater for a wide range of capabilities. You also have the challenge that AI is still maturing, and that user experience platforms still trying to figure out how they seamlessly shift a user from one app to another, and how that all works together. And I've seen a lot of organizations succeed at the bottom end of this diagram, and at the same time seen a lot of them really struggle as they've tried to move up it. It's been really interesting because what a lot of organizations don't think about is two things. One is, as I mentioned before, the customer. Where does the user really fit into this? And two is the back-end process. So connecting, as I said, connecting the ERP to the building so that enterprise resources can be brought to bear on the requirements of business process and deliver proper controlled and standardized outcomes for consumers. Once you do that, you have to keep in mind that at the end of this journey, we have people connected by solutions to buildings. And that's a complex web of individuals and entities all interacting with each other. And that creates a level of complexity that has taken a long time to be effectively automated and adopted. It's really interesting because I was part of an organization, a startup in 2001. And to be honest, we failed because we were ahead of our time. The solution we were putting forward back then is something that was re-released again in 2018 and has now achieved adoption in the market. And that's been really interesting to see that it took nearly 20 years for the market to be ready for something that we thought was a good idea almost 20 years ago. And that's a real lesson for anyone in the startup business. And that brings me to this point, which is that it's not so much about the detail on this slide, it's about the fact that this slide is telling a real story for my previous comment, and that is there was no market need. Right? Those involved in PropTech, when I talk to people in PropTech, when I talk to people who are considering investing in PropTech or buying something from a startup, the question I always ask is, what are you selling to who and for how much? Simple question. Actually, in reality, quite difficult to answer. The key to success is being able to answer that. If you ask me, I've been watching startups in the real estate space for 20 years and longer, and really that's the key question that is the key to success. And what it means is, do you know the problem that you're solving, and who are you solving it for, and how much value do you put on getting their problem solved, or how much value do they put on getting their problem solved? Many times the issue is that there's no real need for the solution. What that means is that the perceived problem is either only a problem for a small group of people, or it's a problem that's in a broader value chain, and therefore there's some other way of solving it, and that point solution is just not the point. In my experience, if a startup CEO can identify the problem and how their solution solves it, they're doing okay. If they know who has the pain of the problem, then they're doing better. And finally, if they can understand the value of their solution and explain how the user gets value, then I think they've got most likely a viable market. The answer, if it's a good one, should take 30 seconds for a CEO to deliver, or less. It's an elevator pitch, and under 5 minutes really to get into the detail and explain it all. And in my experience, about 50% of startups in PropTech can't answer the question, and in my opinion and in my experience, they fail. 25% can answer the question, but struggle to get it right. They get close. And to me, that means there's a problem owner value connection that's not being made properly, and they really need to think it through and get better at it. The remaining issue is, can they actually build a minimum viable product that solves the problem effectively and creates the value? So if you say about 25% of folk are going to have a crack at that, then a lot of them really struggle with that minimum viable product. They focus on functional solution instead of thinking about the entire value solution. And that's where a lot of organizations get it wrong. And as a result, about 10% of startups make it. Some in a somewhat small way, some really make it big as unicorns. And I'd have to say, I've learned that lesson the hard way, being part of 4 startups, some successful, some not, and continue to keep going at it, because I think it's an important thing to do. So in closing, I guess what I'd say is we continue to serve the industry, and we're fine in terms of dealing with the COVID situation. We've been doing a lot of work to help our clients better deal with the situations that they're faced with at the moment. And we've been working hard to make sure that we support our clients with remote working tools. Yeah, and in terms of China, I would say definitely watch this space. It's going to continue to do what it's been doing, which is to grow and evolve rapidly and to continue to innovate in the PropTech space. And similarly, I'd say you know, the key to success is always about connecting business process with the customer in mind and understanding what the value is for the customer. So that's me. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Well, thank you for that, Bernie. I'm looking at the Q&A panel right now. I don't see any questions that have come through, but I did have a question for you. So at the earlier on in your presentation, you mentioned that within China, there are several smart cities that are well advanced or on their way, and that 5G is actually been deployed a lot as well. I was wondering if you had any comments on the comparing that with the Alphabet Sidewalk Labs, which has recently decided not to move forward with its Toronto Smart City project. If you have any comments on that and what they might have been able to do or didn't do compared to what you've been seeing.
Yeah, no, thank you. Excellent question. Excellent question. And very relevant. Yeah, I was very disappointed to see that news this week. I think I know a lot of folk who have been involved in that particular project in Toronto. And to see them finally have to pull out in frustration, I think is very sad. And I think there are a couple of things. One is that, and I'd say an overarching point would be the level of government support is very, very high in China for technology and for technology leadership. It's a stated objective of the government to be a technology leader globally, and there's a lot of investment in that and in specific industries. So that's number one. Number two would be a combination of attitudes amongst the population. One is that I think is definitely an attitude in China is one that is, I want things to work smoothly, seamlessly. The idea of being able to get something instantly is not new in China. 10, 15, 20 years ago, you call the local supermarket, someone will deliver something in 5 minutes. It's always been that way. So there's that high level of expectation of immediate satisfaction of my needs. And businesses in China have really built themselves to do that. And thirdly is, I think, a much greater acceptance in China of the fact that you give up some privacy to get some benefit. You know, I've been watching, I think, through the current situation where that attitude has really gotten a few countries into some interesting situations, whereas in China it's not an issue. And that has, yes, there's an enforcement component to it, but at the same time, the general attitude of the population is that's what we do anyway. We'll comply, and we'll provide that additional information because we get a benefit. So yeah, I think it's a whole combination of things that make it easier for acceptance and adoption, and there's a demand there. And at the same time, if I look at Sidewalk Labs, there was always a question about, what value are you creating for who? And how do you capture that value and turn it into revenue?
Perfect. Thank you. There's a couple more questions that came in. We have a few more minutes here.
Yeah.
So the first one here is, how is the data governance in China in terms of ensuring they aren't too muddy in terms of real estate data?
Interesting. So there's, I look at the term real estate data, and I see, I guess, two definitions. One is the strict definition of, this is property data. This is about how much apartments are getting sold for. And I'd have to say, you can go to any of the local government websites in China and you will get absolutely full disclosure on everything that's been sold. Most developers will publish a grid of all of their developments and show exactly what's been sold and how much for and all that sort of detail. It's all there. Real easy. It's really tough on the commercial data. It's a lot more murky, but residential data is very clear. I think the broader issue, though, is, as we understand AI and big data pools now, is that there is an enormous amount of data with people like Tencent and Alibaba, because if you understand the users of those platforms, everything's location-based. A lot of it's to do with buying stuff, with playing games, with who you know, where you've been, all of that data, which can tell you a lot of things about real estate and about demand for real estate and usage of real estate, is all in a couple of very large data pools. And that's very closely guarded. And I've spoken to the guys who own that data and look after that data, and they've only really just started to look at real estate as a perspective on those data pools. So it's interesting. Is it muddy? I think there's, as I said, in the sales space, absolute clarity. In the broader data pool, yeah, it's muddy, but is the governance getting better? Definitely.
Perfect. And we have time for one more question here. I'm going to go with, this is not really a country specific. There is a lot of talk and focus on using technology to automate design and its processes. What are your thoughts on the future evolving role of design?
Thanks. Interesting question. And I think maybe you would note that a lot of my time is spent more around managing property rather than designing and building it, but nonetheless, it's an area I'm interested in. And yeah, look, I definitely see. It's one of the things a friend of mine said to me recently. The level of maturity of AI, as an example, is it's a 4-year-old. It looks up in the sky and it can see an airplane and says airplane, but it's not really sophisticated enough to go and design one just yet. But the just yet is important, and I think we'll continue to see an evolution where the mundane, laborious, time-consuming, and therefore expensive components of design will be further automated. I have a friend who sits in an office in London with a crayon and designs buildings, and then 300 people run around with computers and try and turn those drawings into buildings. And I think those 300 people are probably going to get automated over time. The guy with the crayon, not so much.